A jealous mistress explodes in rage and kicks a pregnant wife to the ground in the middle of a courtroom, her scream tearing through the stunned silence while faces turn pale with shock. The husband does nothing. He remains cold and indifferent, defending his mistress while the woman carrying his child struggles to breathe. No one knows that this violence is unfolding in front of the only man who can destroy them both. The judge about to take the bench is no stranger. He is her father. And when the truth is revealed, the power, the lies, and the silence will collapse all at once. Leave a comment below so we can talk about it. The courthouse was frozen in that rigid moment before the authority arrived. Everyone was standing, every sound silenced under the sterile glare of white lights, when the tension that had been brewing all morning finally exploded, because the woman in the emerald green dress was no longer pretending to be serene. Her jaw tightened, her fingers curled at her sides as jealousy and rage flooded her face. Her eyes were fixed on the pregnant woman in the pale, light blue maternity dress, who stood in silence near the lawyer's table. One hand rested on her rounded belly, unaware that she had just become the target of something much darker than whispered insults or threats. And in that fraction of a second when restraint failed, the mistress, Serena, took a step forward with sharp intent, her heels striking the polished floor with force, her breathing accelerating, her shoulders squared, every line of her body telegraphing fury. And without hesitation, without warning, she twisted her hips and thrust her leg forward, the movement swift and deliberate, the heel of her shoe cutting through the air before crashing directly into the abdomen of the pregnant woman, Madison. It was a direct and vicious kick delivered to the center of the most vulnerable place on her body, the impact landing with a dull and brutal thud that echoed throughout the courtroom, shocking in its clarity, shocking in its purpose. As if the room itself recoiled at the sound, Madison gasped sharply. A piercing scream tore from her throat as pain detonated inside her, her hand flying to her stomach by instinct, fingers clutching fabric and flesh as her breath vanished instantly. Her eyes widened with disbelief before her knees gave way. The force of the kick threw her off balance, making her stumble backward as the world tilted violently. Chairs scraped, voices erupted. Someone shouted her name. But Serena did not back down. She stood there an instant longer, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with triumph and hatred, her foot returning to the floor as if she had only taken a step forward, rather than committing an act of overt violence in the heart of a courthouse. That moment of stillness made the scene even more horrible, because it showed intent. It showed control. It showed that the kick had not been an accident or a reflex, but a choice driven by anger and entitlement. As the pregnant woman collapsed, her body doubling inward as she hit the cold stone floor, the soft blue fabric of her dress spreading beneath her, while both arms wrapped around her belly in a desperate, protective reflex. Her breath came in ragged gasps that scraped painfully against her chest, her face losing color under the harsh lights, lips trembling, skin paling as sweat broke out across her forehead. The sound of her labored breathing filled the room through the still-open microphone. Each shallow inhalation amplified, each shaky exhalation exposing the gravity of the moment. Because this was no ordinary fall. It was a pregnant woman reacting to blunt force trauma, her abdomen tightening uncontrollably as her body responded to the shock, muscles contracting, pain irradiating downward. Fear flooded her eyes as she curled slightly to one side to protect her unborn child, whispering broken words intended only for the life inside her. Around her, the courtroom erupted in chaos. Lawyers shouted for help. A court officer rushed forward. Someone screamed for medical assistance. voices clashing as protocol broke down under the urgency. However, at the center of it all, Serena remained standing, her chin lifted, expression hard, her gaze briefly sweeping the scene with a cold satisfaction that sent a wave of disbelief through the witnesses. Because there was no remorse in her posture, no shock at what she had done, only defiance. The assumption that this act, like so many others in her world, would be smoothed over by money and influence. And then there was the husband, Franklin, the millionaire whose name dominated the case file, standing only a few feet away, watching the woman carrying his unborn child, lying gasping on the floor, his expression rigid, unreadable. He offered no instinctive movement toward her, did not rush to her side, did not shout in indignation. His silence cut deeper than the kick itself, because it confirmed to everyone present that this violence was not just personal, but had been permitted, had been tolerated, and was part of a greater cruelty that had now exploded in public view. As the pregnant woman's breathing became more irregular, her hands trembled where she pressed them against her abdomen. Fear tightened her features as she struggled to stay conscious. The reality of her vulnerability settled heavily over the room, silencing even the loudest voices, because everyone could see the danger now, the risk to the child, the possibility that this single act could end 2 lives instead of 1. The court officers knelt beside her, their voices steady but tense, as they instructed her to keep breathing, to stay still, to focus. Meanwhile, another officer immobilized the mistress at a distance. Her protests were sharp and indignant, insisting it wasn't her fault, insisting that the pregnant woman had provoked her, insisting on her own innocence, even while the cameras mounted high on the walls captured every angle of the assault, even while smartphones in trembling hands recorded the aftermath, even while the official court recording preserved every sound without mercy. As emergency services were called, trembling voices reported an assault on a pregnant woman with possible obstetric complications. The weight of what had happened became undeniable. This was not a heated argument or a private dispute, but a calculated act of violence committed in the one place designed to prevent exactly this type of harm. As Madison lay there clutching her stomach, struggling to breathe with fear etched on her face, the truth settled in the air like a suffocating fog. Nothing about this day would continue as planned. Nothing would be minimized or dismissed, because Serena's rage had crossed a line that could not be erased. With one furious kick delivered in open court, she had triggered a reckoning that would play out in full view of the law, the public, and the man who was about to cross the doors and take the judge's seat, unaware that the woman lying broken on the floor was his daughter. He was unaware that this moment of uncontrolled anger had just set the stage for consequences much greater than anyone in that room could yet imagine. She lay on the courtroom floor, as if the earth itself had risen to meet her, the cold stone pressing through the thin fabric of her maternity dress, robbing the warmth from her body. Shock still resonated in her ears. Her knees were folded beneath her and then slipped uselessly to the side, while pain surged from her abdomen in heavy waves, each sharper than the last, forcing the air from her lungs so abruptly that she could only gasp in shallow, staccato bursts. Instinct took control where reason failed. Both arms circled her belly firmly as she curled up, shoulders hunched, chin tucked, every muscle tensing to protect the life within her from a danger that no longer felt abstract or distant, but terrifyingly immediate. Her fingers clawed at the soft fabric of her waist, as if by holding on, she could somehow anchor her child and keep him safe, keep him alive. The sounds of the courtroom swelled and clashed around her, voices raised in alarm, chairs scraping violently against the floor, approaching footsteps. Yet everything felt muffled and distorted, as if she were submerged underwater. She was conscious only of the beating of her heart and the stabbing pain pulsing in the lower part of her body. Her face lost color so rapidly it left her lips pale and trembling, a sheen of cold sweat breaking out on her forehead as her body reacted to the trauma. Her breathing accelerated, more desperate, each inhalation too small to satisfy the burning need in her chest. Somewhere above her, a microphone, still on, transmitted the terrifying sound of her labored breaths through the room, magnifying her vulnerability and making every witness acutely aware that this was a medical emergency. Her abdomen tightened painfully without her control, a response she recognized too well from the warnings her doctor had given her, a stress response that could trigger premature labor, a signal that her body had registered the blow as a grave threat. Fear flooded her eyes as she looked at the bright lights above, blinking rapidly to prevent the darkness at the edges of her vision from closing in. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but produced only a strained, breathless sound. Then came the words, fractured and silent, whispered between clenched teeth, intended for no one else in that room but the son she carried. Soft promises, pouring out between gasps, assurances she barely believed herself, but clung to because they were all she had. Hands reached toward her from different directions. A lawyer fell to his knees at her side, his voice steady but urgent, telling her to stay still, to focus on breathing, to turn slightly on her side to relieve the pressure on her abdomen. Another person hovered nearby, unsure of where to step, afraid of making things worse, while a court officer pushed through the crowd and knelt nearby, assessing her state and calling for medical assistance with a voice that cut through the noise. Despite the chaos, she felt strangely alone in that moment, her world reduced to the pain in her body, and the fragile life she feared was slipping out of control. When she tried to breathe more deeply, a sharp pain caught her, stealing her breath and forcing a faint cry from her throat that made several people flinch. It was the sound of someone suffering beyond endurance. Yet, she clung to her belly, fingers pressing instinctively as if she could shield her son from harm through pure will. Her body was trembling now, exhaustion settling in, even as the adrenaline surged. The humiliation of lying there in front of strangers mixed with terror. Tears stung her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Her jaw was tight as she struggled to remain conscious, to remain present, because losing consciousness felt like losing control, and she couldn't afford that. Not now, not when every second mattered. Through the blur of movement, she caught glimpses of shoes and pant legs, flashes of color and shadow. Then the emerald green fabric stood out sharply against the neutral tones of the room, erect and motionless. The sight of Serena sent another wave of nausea and fear through her, but she looked away, concentrating instead on the ceiling, counting the breaths she could manage, clinging to the rhythm the lawyer urged her to follow. Nearby, someone spoke on the phone, their voice trembling as they described the situation to emergency services, emphasizing the pregnancy, the blow to the abdomen, and the visible distress. Hearing those words spoken aloud made the danger feel even more real, more definitive, because it confirmed what her body already knew, that this was grave. As the minutes stretched on, she realized how heavy her limbs felt and how difficult it was to move even slightly without the pain sharpening. Her hands began to cramp where they pressed protectively against her stomach. Her heart beat wildly. The room seemed to become quieter despite the movement, voices lowered instinctively, a silence falling as the gravity of her condition took hold of those watching. The image was impossible to ignore. A pregnant woman lying on a courtroom floor, pale and trembling, clutching her belly as if her life depended on it. In that silence, she felt a strange clarity pierce through the fear, an acute awareness that this moment had crossed a line that could never be erased. Whatever came next would be shaped by the fact that she was here, on the floor, vulnerable in a place meant to protect her. That realization brought a surge of emotion that tightened her throat, but she still focused on the small, constant task of breathing. As court officers worked to clear the space around her, directing people back and ensuring she had room to lie safely on her side, she felt hands steadying her shoulder, a reassuring touch that anchored her for a moment, reminding her she wasn't completely alone. She whispered again to her unborn son, her voice barely audible, promising to hold on, promising to fight the pain, promising she wouldn't give up. In the distance, the siren of an approaching ambulance resonated faintly, a sound that brought both relief and dread. It meant help was coming, but it also meant this moment was far from over. As she lay there on the cold floor, breathing in superficial and careful bursts, the fear and determination intertwined firmly within her. She understood with painful certainty that this was only the beginning of a long and relentless reckoning, one that had started with a single act of violence and now centered on her and the fragile life she was determined to protect at all costs. Franklin was standing just a few feet from her, close enough to hear the rhythm of her broken breathing through the live microphone, close enough to see how her hands trembled as she clutched her belly. However, he did not move. His polished shoes were firmly planted on the courtroom floor, as if rooted there by calculation rather than shock. His face was carefully composed, his eyes fixed on the scene with a detached intensity that unsettled everyone who noticed. This was not the frozen reaction of a man overwhelmed by fear. It was the stillness of someone measuring the consequences, weighing the optics, deciding what silence could buy him. And while the room swirled with movement around the woman on the floor, he remained erect and distant, shoulders squared under his tailored suit, jaw tense, breathing constant, as if the violence that had just occurred belonged to another world entirely, one that could be managed later with statements and settlements. When his lawyer leaned toward him, speaking in a low and urgent voice, he did not flinch. He did not look at the woman carrying his unborn child. Instead, he kept his gaze forward, eyes slightly narrowed, as if concentrating on an invisible horizon beyond the chaos. He listened, while his lawyer whispered options and precautions, reminding him of the cameras, the witnesses, and reminding him not to say anything yet. He nodded once, slowly, a minimal gesture that said everything. It confirmed what many in the room were beginning to understand. His priority was not the pale, trembling woman on the floor, but the control of the narrative that would follow. When someone shouted his name, a sharp accusation that cut through the noise, he finally turned his head, not toward her, but toward the speaker. Irritation flashed briefly across his features before he masked it. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, almost bored. He said there had been confusion, that emotions had run high, and that accidents happen. Words chosen carefully to deflect rather than acknowledge. The effect was immediate and chilling. In that moment, his refusal to name what everyone had seen felt like a second blow. More silent, but just as cruel. Madison heard him too, through the haze of pain and fear. His voice cut through her struggle to breathe, confirming what she had long suspected, but hoped would never be proven so publicly. When forced to choose between protecting her and protecting himself, he would always choose himself. As she lay there fighting to stay conscious, that realization pressed against her chest more painfully than the impact itself. For betrayal carried a weight no bruise could match. Around them, the reaction was swift and visceral. Murmurs turned into sharp whispers. Eyes flickered between the man in the suit and the woman on the floor. Incredulity etched on faces as people struggled to reconcile his composure with the gravity of what happened. A court officer looked at him with open disapproval before refocusing on the emergency. Another witness raised a phone higher, capturing his stillness as much as the aftermath of the assault, instinctively understanding that this moment mattered, that his lack of response was a statement in itself. As the lawyer continued to mutter at his side, Franklin shifted his weight slightly, a subtle adjustment, and finally took a step back, not toward her, but away from the spotlight, creating distance as if proximity alone carried risk. His expression tightened when someone suggested he check on her. He dismissed the suggestion with a brief shake of the head. The implication would complicate things, imply responsibility, and responsibility was a language he had spent years avoiding. The courtroom felt colder for it, the air thick with an unspoken judgment pressing from all sides. Yet he seemed insulated from it, protected by wealth, by habit, and by a life of seeing problems dissolve when enough money was applied. While emergency teams and procedures were discussed, he remained silent. His eyes occasionally flickered toward the emerald green figure immobilized at a distance, a look of irritation crossing his face that had nothing to do with the violence itself and everything to do with the inconvenience. He was already calculating how this interruption would ripple outward, how it would affect negotiations, public perception, and deadlines. When someone finally confronted him directly, voice trembling with anger, asking how he could stand there while his pregnant wife lay injured on the floor, he responded without raising his voice and with no visible emotion. He insisted she was exaggerating, that there was no proof of intent, and that the situation was being overblown. Those words fell heavily in the room because they reframed the pain as a performance and the injury as a strategy. By doing so, he eliminated the last traces of doubt about his stance. Madison closed her eyes briefly. Tears finally escaped despite her resolution, not just from the pain, but because the man she once trusted had just chosen to abandon her in front of everyone. As the court officers worked to maintain order and voices lowered as the gravity of the scene settled, his stillness remained the most unsettling element of all, a raw counterpoint to the urgency unfolding around him. While others rushed to protect and help, he stood apart, untouched by the crisis he had helped create through his indifference. In that separation, a line was drawn that could not be erased, a line between power and humanity, between image and responsibility. And although he didn't know it yet, and though his focus remained stubbornly fixed on damage control and self-preservation, that choice to stand still, to deny, to distance himself from the woman on the floor, would soon bring consequences much greater than any legal maneuver he could afford. Silence in the face of violence is never neutral. In that courtroom, with cameras watching and witnesses remembering, his silence had already begun to speak for him, louder than any defense he would try to mount later. Serena stood in the center of the storm she had created. The emerald green of her dress was vivid against the muted tones of the courtroom. Her shoulders were back, her chin lifted, her breathing steady now that the burst of anger had consumed her. The way she carried herself told a story long before she spoke, for there was no shock in her posture, no hint of regret in her eyes, only a hard, bright certainty that she was still in control, and that this room, like so many others before, would bend to her will. As the court officers moved to maintain distance between her and the woman on the floor, she did not shrink or protest in fear. She sneered, her lips curling with disdain, as if the concern flooding the room were an overreaction. Her gaze briefly swept the group kneeling beside the pregnant woman, before settling with marked emphasis on the man in the tailored suit, seeking comfort not in words, but in the unspoken pact they had always shared, the understanding that he would protect her and that consequences were things other people faced. When an officer firmly told her to step back, she obeyed with exaggerated patience, lifting her hand slightly, as if to say she had nothing to hide. Her voice was sharp and controlled, as she insisted she had been provoked, that she had been pushed too far, and that emotions run high in situations like this. Her tone had a touch of entitlement that pierced the room. She didn't ask for understanding. She demanded it. The murmurs that followed her words only seemed to fuel her defiance. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the faces observing her with incredulity and anger. Instead of softening, she hardened, drawing strength from their attention and the feeling that all eyes were on her. She had never learned to retreat, only to dominate. When someone openly accused her of attacking a pregnant woman, her laugh was short and incredulous, a sound that bounced coldly off the walls. She dismissed the accusation with a wave of her hand, claiming exaggeration and drama, and that people were too eager to paint her as a villain. That refusal to acknowledge the reality of what she had done sent a wave of indignation through the room. It redefined violence as a misunderstanding, pain as manipulation, and the suffering of the pregnant woman as an inconvenience to be explained away. Yet she continued, her voice rising enough to be heard, reminding everyone who she was, the connections she had, the lawyers who would handle this, the statements that would follow, and the truth that would be shaped later. As she spoke, her confidence seemed to grow, each sentence reinforcing the belief that she was untouchable, that even here, in a court of law, the rules were flexible for someone like her. The court officers exchanged glances, recognizing the familiar pattern of someone accustomed to bending systems without consequence. The witnesses in the gallery watched in stunned silence, phones held high, capturing not only the aftermath of the assault, but the chilling composure of the woman responsible. She noticed the cameras, too, offering them a brief, practiced smile that vanished just as quickly, a calculated expression intended to project calm and control, because she understood appearances. She always had. When the pregnant woman cried out softly from the floor, a weak and painful sound, Serena's eyes flickered in her direction for only a second. Irritation crossed her features before she looked away again, as if acknowledging that sound would grant it power. In that refusal to look, there was a cruelty as sharp as the kick itself, a deliberate denial of the humanity lying at her feet. When someone asked her to show some remorse, to at least acknowledge the gravity of what happened, she bristled. Her shoulders tensed, her voice cutting with icy precision as she declared she would not be lectured, that she had done nothing wrong, and that the situation was being twisted against her. The sheer audacity of that statement seemed to drain the air from the room, for it revealed not just her lack of remorse, but her certainty that the system would ultimately protect her, that this moment would pass like all others, smoothed over by influence and money. Yet beneath that certainty, there was something else, a tension in the way her fingers flexed, a sharpness in her eyes as she watched the officers and lawyers move, as she heard the word ambulance spoken aloud. She realized this would not be resolved in silence, not immediately, and not without scrutiny. That realization irritated her more than it frightened her, because scrutiny threatened the image she had cultivated so carefully. As the minutes passed and the room focused grimly on the injured woman, Serena found herself increasingly isolated. Her defiance was no longer commanding attention, but provoking it. When an officer informed her she needed to remain where she was, that statements would be taken, and that this was now a serious matter. Her expression tightened. The smile vanished completely as anger ignited again, this time bordered by something closer to uncertainty. She responded sharply with biting questions, demanding to know under what authority she was being detained, invoking names and affiliations, reminding them that her lawyers would have something to say. But the firmness of the response she received marked a change she couldn't ignore. For the first time, the room was not yielding to her tone. The realization hit her hard that this place, unlike the private rooms and closed doors where she usually held power, operated by different rules. As that understanding settled, her defiance took on a more fragile edge, still loud, still unapologetic, but less sure. Her eyes flickered more frequently. Her posture was just a fraction less relaxed, yet she refused to yield, clinging to indignation as her shield. Admitting guilt would mean admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability had never been an option for her. As the sirens outside grew louder, signaling the arrival of medical help, the contrast between her standing figure and the woman on the floor became impossible to ignore. One was upright and defiant. The other was curled up and pale, fighting pain and fear. That contrast told its own story to everyone watching, a story of cruelty and entitlement that no amount of denial could erase. Though she didn't yet grasp the full scope of what she had unleashed, and though she still believed she could get away with it, the truth was already being recorded, preserved by cameras, witnesses, and the collective memory of that room. Her defiance, loud and unapologetic as it was, would soon serve as its own evidence, a testimony not just to what she had done, but to who she was when faced with the consequences of her actions. The urgency of the moment finally dominated the chaos, transforming the courtroom from a place of discussion into an emergency response space. Court officers moved with firm authority to clear the area around the pregnant woman. Their voices were controlled, but unmistakably urgent, instructing spectators to step back and let trained hands work. Madison felt the change immediately, the atmosphere tightening into something focused and purposeful. Fear continued to pulse through her body. Her hands were still clasped around her belly, fingers aching from the tension. Her breathing was shallow and irregular as another wave of pain spread through her lower abdomen, causing a sharp gasp she couldn't repress. A court officer knelt beside her, quickly introducing himself. His tone was calm and steady as he asked her name, how far along she was, and if she felt the pain intensifying. These questions were asked with precision because time mattered now. She responded in short, broken sentences, struggling to get words out between breaths. Her voice was trembling, but clear enough to convey the most important detail. She was 7 months pregnant and feared something was wrong. Those words seemed to focus the situation even more sharply. Another officer transmitted the information over the radio, repeating it with emphasis. Pregnant female, blunt abdominal trauma, signs of distress, requesting immediate medical response. Hearing her condition described aloud made her chest tighten with dread. It confirmed what her body was already telling her, that this was grave. This was not a pain she could simply breathe through and forget. While they worked, someone guided her gently onto her side, placing a folded jacket behind her back to support the position. A medically sound choice to reduce pressure on her abdomen and improve blood flow. She clung to that small adjustment with gratitude, even as the floor remained relentlessly cold beneath her. Her cheek pressed briefly against the stone while she fought another contraction or tightening. Her face contorted despite her effort to remain still. The officer noticed immediately, asking her to rate the pain and describe if it came and went, or was constant. She shook her head weakly. Tears finally escaped as she admitted. It came in waves, a detail that provoked a sharp look from the professionals around her. They understood the implication. Stress-induced uterine activity was a real risk after trauma. One of them told her firmly but kindly to keep breathing, to focus on slow inhalations and exhalations, guiding her through the rhythm with counted words that cut through the noise, anchoring her when her thoughts threatened to spiral out of control. Nearby, another officer documented everything: the time of the assault, the onset of symptoms, and observable signs of distress. This was no longer just an incident to manage. It was evidence. The courtroom felt different now, quieter, heavier. People watched with a growing awareness that what they were witnessing carried legal and medical consequences that would not be easily dismissed. As the minutes passed slowly, the pregnant woman's condition fluctuated. Moments of relative calm were interrupted by sudden flares of pain that took her breath away and left her trembling. Her heart raced with fear every time the tightening returned. The officer stayed close, maintaining eye contact, reminding her she wasn't alone and that help was on the way. Despite everything, the sound of the open microphone continued to betray the intimacy of her struggle. Each labored breath was amplified, making the risk impossible to ignore. And finally, faint but unmistakable, the distant wail of sirens filtered through the thick courthouse walls, a sound that brought a complicated wave of relief and anxiety. It meant help was near, but it also meant the gravity of the situation had escalated beyond any attempt to minimize it. When the paramedics arrived, their presence was immediate and commanding. Their uniforms cut through the crowd as they pushed a stretcher toward her. Their movements were efficient, their questions fast and precise. She felt a gloved hand evaluate her abdomen gently but firmly, looking for tenderness. Another measured her pulse, and another placed an oxygen mask over her face to help stabilize her breathing. The cool rush of air was both surprising and soothing, easing the tightness in her chest enough so she could focus again. One of the paramedics spoke to her in a low voice, explaining each step and reassuring her even while exchanging worried glances with his partner. The signs were clear. Abdominal trauma during pregnancy is always treated as high risk, and her symptoms warranted immediate transport and evaluation. As they prepared to lift her to the stretcher, she panicked briefly, clinging to her belly and fearing the movement would make things worse. But they moved with care, supporting her weight and keeping her on her side. Once settled, the paramedic spoke into the radio, transmitting details to the receiving hospital. Pregnant patient, 3rd trimester, blunt trauma, signs of uterine activity, en route. Those clinical words resonated loudly in the room, stripping away any remaining illusion that this was a minor incident. As the stretcher began to roll, escorted by officers clearing the way, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. They watched the woman who had entered seeking a legal resolution now being rushed out in a medical emergency. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear and determination as she watched the ceiling pass overhead. She whispered again to her unborn son, her voice muffled by the oxygen mask, promising to stay strong, promising to fight, promising she wouldn't let this moment be the end. Behind her, the room she left was buzzing with a new, sober energy. Lawyers spoke in low, urgent tones. Officers coordinated next steps. Witnesses processed what they had seen. The situation had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. When the ambulance doors closed and the siren blared again, taking her away from the courthouse, the weight of what happened settled completely. This was no longer just a legal drama. It was a medical crisis and a documented assault. A chain of events had been set in motion that would now follow a much more relentless path, one governed by hospital protocols, legal procedures, and the undeniable truth that the life of a pregnant woman and her unborn child had been put at risk in the one place meant to guarantee safety and justice. That reality would shape everything that came next. By the time the ambulance doors closed and the echo of the siren faded down the street, the courtroom had transformed once again. It entered a colder, sharper phase where emotion gave way to documentation. The weight of the evidence began to press upon everyone present because what had happened could no longer be argued as confusion or chaos. It was now a sequence of recorded facts. The first thing court officials did was secure the room, sealing it in a quiet, methodical manner that left no doubt about the seriousness of the moment. An officer approached the court clerk's desk and confirmed that the official audio recording had remained active throughout the incident, capturing every sound, from the click of heels to the hollow impact of the kick and the labored breathing that followed. Another officer moved toward the wall monitors and requested immediate access to the security camera footage, his voice steady as he indicated the timestamps to ensure nothing was overwritten or lost. The clerk obeyed without hesitation, fingers moving quickly across the console as the footage was flagged and preserved. Everyone understood now. This was an assault in a government building recorded from multiple angles. The reality of it sat heavily on the room as witnesses saw the screens come to life, replaying the moment with raw clarity. The figure in emerald green advancing, the sudden violent movement, the pregnant woman collapsing. The scene played out again without the buffer of shock, stripped of noise and confusion, reduced to undeniable images. With each replay, the room grew quieter, as if sound itself had retreated in deference to the gravity of what was shown. A court officer narrated softly, pointing out the sequence, the distance, the lack of provocation, and the deliberate nature of the movement, details spoken calmly, but carrying immense weight, as they would later form part of an official report. Nearby, another officer collected statements, approaching witnesses one by one, asking them to describe exactly what they saw and where they were standing. Several people volunteered their phones, hands trembling slightly as they unlocked screens to show videos they had captured immediately after, footage that included not just the assault, but the reactions, the stillness of the man in the tailored suit, and the defiance of the woman immobilized nearby. These recordings were accepted, cataloged, and registered, each one a thread woven into a tightening net of evidence. As this process unfolded, the atmosphere turned almost clinical, as if the room itself recognized that the truth no longer needed emotion to move forward. The millionaire felt this change acutely. Though he said little, his lawyer now stood closer, whispering less and listening more. There was nothing left to manipulate. There was only evidence accumulating in real time. When an officer approached them to confirm identities and roles, the questions were direct and formal, delivered without accusation, but with unmistakable authority. The man responded curtly, his composure intact but tense, aware that every word was now part of the record. Across the aisle, Serena's earlier defiance was silenced as she realized the extent of what was being preserved. Her gaze repeatedly drifted toward the monitors, despite herself, drawn back to the images she could no longer dismiss or rewrite. When the officer informed her that the footage clearly showed intent and contact, her jaw tightened. Her protest began and then died in her throat. Images don't argue. They simply exist. The clerk continued documenting the interruption of proceedings, the medical emergency, and the removal of the injured party, all registered with timestamps that would anchor the narrative to specific moments. The official incident report took shape piece by piece, listing the location, involved parties, observed actions, response, and the victim's transfer to emergency medical care. Each detail built a structure that could withstand scrutiny. As the minutes passed, an understanding spread silently through the room. This case had crossed a boundary. It was no longer confined to civil matters or private complaints. An assault on a pregnant woman inside a courthouse carried implications that extended far beyond a single hearing. When a senior official arrived to oversee the process, his presence formalized what many already felt. This matter would be referred upward, reviewed, and pursued with the full weight of the system. He instructed his team to ensure the chain of custody for all recordings and to secure copies of the footage. This level of rigor left no room for doubt later. The witnesses watched this unfold with a mix of awe and unease, realizing they were part of something much larger than a dramatic moment. They were participants in the creation of an impregnable record. The silence that settled was different from before. It was no longer about shock, but was heavy with inevitability. The truth had been captured from too many angles to escape. As the final confirmations were made, the clerk announced that proceedings were officially suspended, pending further action. The words resonated softly, but decisively. In that announcement lay the acknowledgement that the courtroom had done its part for now, moving the matter to a process that would continue beyond these walls. The man in the suit felt the weight of that continuation, even as he maintained his outward calm. He finally understood that control was slipping away, not because of indignation or opinion, but because of documentation. Cameras and recordings do not forget. As the officers concluded their work, securing the evidence and dispersing the remaining onlookers, the room emptied slowly. It left an impression that lingered long after the doors closed, the feeling that something irreversible had occurred, that a line had been crossed and permanently marked in files, footage, and memory. From this point on, the story would no longer be told by those with the loudest voices or the deepest pockets, but by the silent and relentless accumulation of proof that now existed, waiting to speak for the woman who had been carried out on a stretcher, and for the truth that had been captured without mercy in the place where justice was supposed to begin. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a muffled sound that cut through the lingering tension. Without announcement or ceremony, the judge entered. His presence immediately altered the room's atmosphere, for authority carries a weight felt before it is spoken. As he advanced in his black robes, conversations died mid-sentence, officers straightened, and lawyers fell silent. He walked with measured steps toward the bench, his eyes scanning the interrupted order, the empty space where the injured woman had been, the officers posted near the gallery, and the marks from the medical stretcher still visible on the floor. In that instant, something changed, subtle and deeply personal. Recognition hit him with the force of certainty, not through words, but through absence. The knowledge that the woman who should have been there was gone. That knowledge sat heavily behind his serene expression, even as he continued forward without hesitation. Years on the bench had trained him to separate reaction from action. He climbed the steps with the same deliberate precision he had shown every day of his career. Taking his seat, he placed his hands flat before him, posture straight, eyes forward. When he spoke, his voice was firm and controlled, devoid of any tremor that might betray the internal storm. He formally acknowledged the interruption and requested a summary of the events that had occurred in his absence. The clerk responded promptly, describing the assault, the medical emergency, the transport of the pregnant woman to the hospital, and the preservation of evidence. As each detail was spoken aloud, the judge listened without interruption, his face impassive. Yet inside him, each word landed with personal weight. The injured party was not an abstract figure in a case file. She was his daughter. The knowledge of that connection pressed against the discipline he had perfected for decades, testing it in ways he had never anticipated. However, he did not flinch or reveal his pain. The courtroom was not a place for personal grief or paternal instinct. It was a place governed by the law, and he understood that better than anyone. When he finally looked up to address the room, his eyes moved first toward the officers, then the lawyers, then briefly toward the individuals at the center of the incident. His gaze was neutral and evaluative. In that neutrality resided a profound act of restraint. It would have been easy, devastatingly easy, to react as a father, to demand answers, to show rage. Instead, he spoke as a judge. He acknowledged the gravity of the incident, confirmed that proceedings were suspended, and instructed that all relevant evidence remain secured and properly recorded. His words were precise, procedural, and unassailable. Those who listened felt the gravity of his tone, recognizing that this was not a man to be swayed by emotion or pressure. As he continued, he requested confirmation of the condition and location of the injured party. The question was asked professionally, but carried a depth only he understood. Upon being informed she had been transported to the hospital for evaluation, he nodded once. A small movement masking a torrent of concern he forced himself to contain. The room watched him closely, sensing that something in this moment was different, that there was an intensity beneath his calm that sharpened every word. When he addressed the presence of the alleged aggressor and the related parties, his voice remained even but firm. He outlined that further measures would be taken according to the law and that the process would proceed without deviation. By doing so, he established a clear boundary. This matter would not be handled discreetly or smoothed over. It would be treated with the gravity it demanded. The realization of that fact sat heavily on those present, especially on the man in the tailored suit, who felt, perhaps for the first time, a crack in the armor of confidence he had worn so easily before. The judge's behavior was not that of someone looking for a compromise. It was that of someone committed to principle. As the judge concluded his initial remarks, he reminded the room of its obligations to the law, to due process, and to the integrity of the court. His words resonated beyond the immediate moment. Then, with one last look that lingered just a fraction longer on the empty space where his daughter had been, he asked that order be maintained and declared the court adjourned. The sound of his gavel hitting the block echoed with finality. In that sound resided a promise, unspoken but unmistakable. What had begun in violence would be answered with clarity. Personal connections would not shield misconduct, and the truth, once set in motion, would be followed, wherever it led. As the courtroom emptied slowly, those who remained carried with them the image of a judge who had just faced the severest test of his impartiality and passed it with unwavering resolve. A man who had chosen in that moment to be the embodiment of the law first, even while his heart followed the ambulance carrying his daughter toward an uncertain outcome. That choice, made in silence and without spectacle, marked the beginning of a reckoning that would unfold with the full force of justice behind it. When the courtroom reconvened under a different weight, the air felt thicker, charged with a silent anticipation that had replaced the previous chaos. The judge sat composed behind the bench, his posture unchanged, his expression controlled. Officers confirmed that all parties were present and that the preserved recordings were ready for review. With a quiet directive, he ordered the playback to begin. His voice was firm and procedural, allowing no hint of the emotions the images would stir. The screens came to life, showing the moments everyone had witnessed, but could not escape seeing again. the figure in emerald green advancing, the rapid and deliberate movement, the unmistakable contact, and the collapse of the pregnant woman. The sound followed, clear and unfiltered, the hollow impact, the gasp, and the labored breathing captured by the open microphone. As the recording continued, the room fell into a deep silence. The truth unfolded frame by frame without comment, without argument, stripped of interpretation. The judge watched intently, eyes fixed, absorbing every second with the precision of a man trained to weigh facts, not feelings. The clerk marked timestamps, and officers noted angles and continuity, ensuring what was shown was unquestionable. When the playback ended, the silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the judge's measured instruction to replay the critical seconds again, slower this time. The images confirmed what the law required to see: intent, contact, and consequence, without obstruction, without provocation, without ambiguity. With that clarity established, the judge addressed the room, outlining the findings in neutral language. He acknowledged the assault, the medical emergency, and the legal implications inherent in an attack on a pregnant woman within a courthouse. His words were precise, carrying authority without excess. Then he paused, a brief, deliberate pause that drew every eye back to him. In that pause, something changed, because procedure alone could not support what was coming next. He spoke again, his voice unaltered in tone, but altered in gravity. He stated there was a matter of disclosure relevant to the proceedings, a fact necessary to ensure transparency and to forestall speculation. The room collectively leaned forward, sensing the importance of what was about to be said. He continued, identifying the injured party by name, confirming her status as the expectant mother referenced in the case file. Then, without flourish or emphasis, he declared, "She is my daughter." The words were spoken plainly, as if reading a fact into the record, but the effect was immediate and profound. A shockwave moved through the room, held breaths, turning heads, widening eyes. The realization settled like a sudden drop in pressure. The disclosure reframed everything without altering the facts themselves. The judge allowed the moment to register before continuing. He clarified that his relationship with the victim would not alter the application of the law, that he had adhered and would continue to adhere strictly to judicial ethics, and that all actions taken thus far had been in accordance with established procedure. His composure was unwavering as he affirmed his commitment to impartiality. Yet the weight of his disclosure could not be dismissed. It underscored the stakes in a way no legal argument could. Franklin felt the room turn against him, the understanding that the authority before him was not distant or abstract, but personally involved in the outcome, not through favoritism, but through resolve. Serena stiffened, her earlier confidence failing as the implications settled. Her gaze flickered between the bench and the screens, seeking explanations that were no longer valid. The judge proceeded, outlining the next steps: the referral of evidence to the appropriate authorities, the continuation of the matter under strict supervision, and the preservation of due process for all involved. His words were firm and final. As he spoke, it became clear that this disclosure was not a plea nor a threat, but a statement of transparency, an insistence that the process remain unblemished by secrecy or doubt. The courtroom responded accordingly. Officers straightened, lawyers adjusted their notes, and witnesses absorbed the importance of what they had just learned. The narrative had shifted from scandal to accountability. When the judge concluded, he reminded the room that the law does not bend to status or convenience, that facts would speak, and the court would ensure they were heard, fully and fairly. With that, He ordered the record updated to reflect his disclosure and the verified evidence. His gavel struck once, clean and decisive, sealing the moment into the case's official history. As the echo faded, those present understood that the truth had not only been revealed, it had been anchored, tied to the proceedings, with a force that could not be undone. The judge remained seated, composed, eyes forward, embodying the principle he had just articulated. A father who had chosen the law as the instrument of justice for his daughter. In that choice resided the certainty that what would follow would be relentless, measured, and impossible to evade. Because the truth, once spoken into the record, would now move forward with all the authority of the court behind it. The collapse began not with a scream or a dramatic gesture, but with the soft click of handcuffs closing around a wrist. The sound was sharp enough to break the stunned silence of the courtroom, and in that instant, the illusion of control shattered. The woman in the emerald green dress was no longer standing defiantly. She was being guided firmly to her feet by officers speaking in calm, practiced tones, informing her she was being detained pending formal charges related to the assault. Her protests were swift and strident. Words tumbled over one another as she insisted this was a misunderstanding, that lawyers would fix it, and that she had rights. However, none of that slowed the process. The evidence had already moved beyond argument. As the handcuffs were secured, the posture she had clung to dissolved into rigid disbelief. Her eyes scanned the room as if searching for someone to intervene, to stop what was happening. When she looked toward Franklin, she found no rescue waiting, only a man paralyzed in place, his face now pale, his confidence eroding under the weight of what he could no longer control. As the officers escorted her toward the side exit, cameras flashed, phones were held higher, and the image of her being led away became instantaneous and irreversible, an image that would travel far beyond the courthouse walls. With her removal, the focus shifted inevitably to him, the millionaire who had remained silent while his pregnant wife lay injured on the floor. Silence also carries consequences. The judge's measured instructions set those consequences in motion, ordering the documented evidence referred to prosecutors and the matters related to the civil case re-evaluated in light of the assault. The words sounded procedural, but they landed like blows because they signaled a shift in power that money could not undo. Lawyers for both sides began moving quickly, whispering with urgency, recalculating positions that only hours before had seemed secure. Franklin felt the ground slipping out from under his feet, not because he had been directly charged at that moment, but because the narrative that had protected him for years was crumbling in public view. As the courtroom cleared again, the repercussions rippled outward. Reporters gathered outside. Messages flew through phones and networks. Board members and investors watched footage that painted a picture no statement could soften. A pregnant woman assaulted, an impassive husband, a mistress led away in handcuffs. In a matter of hours, the impact was felt where it hurt most. Calls from partners went unanswered. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Stock prices fluctuated, and the once solid image of the empire he had built began to fracture. Trust, once lost, does not wait for verdicts to withdraw. As legal implications multiplied, so did personal ones. The civil case that had brought them to court in the first place was now fundamentally altered. The question of custody and support was no longer abstract. It was now framed by documented violence and neglect. Advisors who had once assured him of favorable outcomes spoke more cautiously, their language shifting from confidence to restraint. Despite everything, his wife's absence loomed large. Her empty spot was a constant reminder that the narrative was no longer his to control, that she was fighting for stability in a hospital room while his world tilted toward collapse. When news reached him that she was under observation and that doctors were monitoring signs of stress and uterine activity, the information brought not relief, but dread. It underscored the reality that his actions and his inaction had put 2 lives at risk. This reality would soon be weighed by the courts and public opinion alike. The judge's role in the unfolding aftermath also became a focal point, not because of favoritism, but because of the clarity with which he had drawn the line, refusing to let personal connection cloud the process and insisting instead on transparency and accountability. That stance resonated beyond the case, sending a message that no amount of wealth could protect misconduct when the facts were clear. As the days passed, subpoenas followed, interviews were scheduled, and the machinery of justice moved with a momentum that could not be stopped. The man who had once believed himself untouchable found doors closing and allies distancing themselves. The familiar protection of privilege thinned under scrutiny. Even in private moments, the silence he had chosen in the courtroom returned to haunt him, replayed endlessly in images and commentary, a defining image that spoke louder than any denial. While the woman in emerald green faced immediate legal peril, he faced something slower, but just as devastating: the erosion of credibility, the unraveling of reputation, and the realization that the empire he had built rested on foundations much more fragile than he had ever admitted. As the courthouse lights dimmed and the city buzzed with speculation, one truth became undeniable. The events of that day had set in motion a reckoning that would not be limited to charges or hearings. It would reach into every corner of their lives, reshaping futures with a force as relentless as it was deserved. By choosing power over humanity and silence over protection, he had aligned himself with the very collapse he was now unable to stop. The hospital corridor was quiet, in a way that felt heavier than noise. Fluorescent lights cast a soft, unchanging glow on the polished floors, while machines hummed constantly behind closed doors. In one of those rooms, Madison lay carefully propped on white pillows. The monitors traced quiet, reassuring lines. Doctors entered and exited with measured confidence, explaining that the immediate danger had passed, that the baby's heartbeat was strong, and that the contractions had subsided. Words that settled over her like a fragile blanket of relief. She closed her eyes briefly, one hand over her belly, breathing more evenly now. She was still in pain, still shocked, but rooted by the steady rhythm of life under her palm. Outside that room, separated by glass and silence, her father stood alone. His posture was straight but heavy with restraint, hands clasped behind his back as he stared at the door. He listened to the muffled sounds of the care being given to her, the small, ordinary noises that suddenly meant everything. For the first time since the courtroom, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what happened, not as a judge, but as a father. The fear that had lodged deep in his chest now loosened enough for him to breathe. He did not enter immediately. He did not rush. The discipline of a lifetime did not disappear in an instant, and he understood that protection did not always come from presence. Sometimes it came from ensuring justice was served. When the doctor finally came out and nodded, confirming she could rest, and that the next few hours would be for monitoring and recovery, he thanked them in a low, steady voice. Only then did he enter the room, moving slowly and deliberately, stopping beside her bed. When she opened her eyes and saw him, the strength she had clung to throughout the ordeal finally softened. Tears welled up despite her attempt to smile. He reached out, placing his hand gently over hers, careful not to disturb the wires or the space she needed. In that touch was everything he hadn't said in the courtroom: fear, pride, regret, resolve. She squeezed his fingers weakly, whispering that the baby was fine, that she was fine, words intended to comfort him as much as herself. He nodded, swallowing the emotion that threatened to surface. He knew this was not the time for apologies or explanations. It was the time to be present. Outside the hospital, the world continued to spin. News cycles replayed images. Commentators dissected the silence and the action. Reputations rose and fell with every update. But inside that room, time slowed to something manageable, something human. As the hours passed, she rested, her breathing deep and steady. Nurses checked vitals and adjusted monitors, offering quiet reassurance. Her father took his place just beyond the doorway again, resuming the role he understood best. The guardian of the process, the one who ensured that what had been started would be finished correctly. In the days that followed, the legal machinery moved forward without spectacle, guided by records, evidence, and the principles he had sworn to uphold long before this case touched his family. There were those who whispered that his position would soften the outcome, that favoritism would creep in. But those whispers faded quickly under the clarity of his actions. He recused himself where necessary, ensured oversight where required, and insisted that every step be transparent. His message was consistent and unwavering. The law did not belong to him, nor to wealth, nor to influence. It belonged to the truth. As Madison recovered, supported by the doctors and the quiet strength she discovered within herself, she began to understand that what had been taken from her in that courtroom could not be returned. But something else had been affirmed: her worth, her resilience, and her right to protection. When she was finally discharged, walking carefully into the sunlight, with one hand on her belly and the other resting briefly on her father's arm, she didn't feel victorious, but she felt steady. That steadiness mattered more than triumph, for it marked a beginning rather than an end. Somewhere in the city, the consequences continued to unfold for those who had chosen cruelty and silence. Legal battles increased, public trust eroded, and futures were reshaped by decisions that could not be undone. Although justice would take time, it had been firmly set in motion, anchored by evidence, guided by principles, and carried out without compromise. As they drove away from the hospital together, the judge and his daughter neither spoke of revenge or punishment. That was not the language of what had happened. The language was accountability, protection, and truth. In the quiet certainty of that understanding, there was a sense of closure that did not depend on spectacle, but on the knowledge that when the moment most demanded it, the law had not bent. It had stood firm. In doing so, it had preserved not only its integrity, but the fragile life that had survived the storm. A life that would grow up knowing that justice, when honored, can be a shield as strong as any power in the world.